In a small town where everyone seemed to know each other's business, the high school halls buzzed with the usual chatter. Yet, underneath the surface, not everything was as simple as it seemed. This was a place where traditions were hard to shake, and change crept in like an unwelcome guest. For one particular student, high school wasn't just about classes or grades, it was about proving something bigger. He was a bright, determined teenager, with a natural curiosity and an unyielding drive to succeed. His love for history wasn't just about memorizing dates or battles, it was about understanding stories, real stories of people who had shaped the world. But he soon realized that not everyone saw history the way he did, especially his teacher. The teacher, an older woman with decades of experience, was known for her stern demeanor. To many, she was just strict. But to him, her remarks carried an edge that others seemed to overlook. The way she dismissed his questions, the subtle ways she corrected his ideas, and how she barely acknowledged his achievements, it all added up. One day, during a discussion on the civil rights movement, the tension between them became undeniable. He raised his hand, eager to share a perspective he had read about in a book from the local library. The teacher, arms crossed and face stern, interrupted him midway. "That's not exactly accurate," she said curtly, before moving on as though his voice didn't matter. The class grew silent, students exchanging uneasy glances. Some looked away, pretending not to notice, while others fidgeted uncomfortably in their seats. He felt the heat rise in his face, not from embarrassment, but from anger. He wasn't wrong, he knew he wasn't, but how could he prove it when the person in charge wouldn't even listen? That night, he went home determined. This wasn't just about earning respect from one teacher, it was about standing up for himself and what he believed in. He pored over books, articles, and documentaries, gathering facts and stories to back up his point. If she wouldn't hear him in class, he'd make sure she couldn't ignore him. The next day, he walked into school with a quiet confidence. He didn't need to call her out or create a scene. He just needed to present his work in a way that spoke for itself. Little did he know, what started as a personal challenge would soon turn the entire school's attention to their classroom and to the teacher who would have no choice but to face her own biases. As he prepared to share what he had learned, a strange energy filled the air. Students leaned in, sensing something important was about to happen. Even the teacher, who rarely seemed fazed by anything, raised an eyebrow in curiosity. But as he began to speak, her expression shifted. What was once confidence now looked like discomfort. And then, something no one expected happened, something that would leave the entire class in stunned silence. The classroom was silent, a kind of silence that felt heavy, almost like everyone was holding their breath at once. He stood there, gripping the edges of his paper, his voice steady even though his heart pounded like a drum in his chest. The words he spoke weren't just facts, they were pieces of history that carried weight, meaning, and truths that had been overlooked, misunderstood, or deliberately ignored for too long. As he continued, his classmates leaned in closer. Even the ones who usually doodled in their notebooks or whispered to each other during lessons seemed captivated. There was something in the way he spoke, an undeniable passion that made people want to listen. He wasn't just reciting dates or quotes. He was weaving together stories of courage and resilience, of people who had stood up against systems designed to keep them down. But the teacher's face told a different story. At first, her expression was unreadable, her arms crossed tightly as if forming a shield. Yet, as his presentation went on, subtle changes began to appear. Her lips thinned, her jaw tightened, and her gaze darted around the room, avoiding his eyes. It was clear that his words weren't just facts to her, they were challenging something deeper. He finished speaking, and for a moment, there was nothing. No applause, no questions, just the faint hum of the overhead lights. Then, a hand shot up from back of the room. A girl with curly hair and a notebook filled with colorful tabs asked, "How did you find all this? I've never heard some of these stories before." He smiled, finally feeling a bit of the tension in his shoulders ease. I spent a lot of time in the library, he replied. These stories are there if you look for them. They're not hidden, just not talked about enough. The teacher cleared her throat, cutting off the moment. While your research is thorough, she said, her voice measured, some of your sources may not be entirely reliable. It's important to cross-check information, especially when dealing with sensitive topics. Her tone was calm, almost polite, but the words stung. It was as if she was trying to undermine everything he had just worked so hard to share. He didn't argue. He had expected this reaction, after all. But he wasn't done, not by a long shot. The next step wasn't about proving her wrong in the classroom. It was about showing everyone, including her, that history wasn't just a subject to be studied. It was a living, breathing narrative that still shaped their world today. Over the next few weeks, the tension between them grew. She would throw out subtle challenges during lessons, rephrasing parts of history in ways that seemed to erase the contributions of certain groups. He, in turn, would find ways to bring those voices back into the conversation, always armed with evidence. The class began to notice. Some students whispered about how brave he was to keep speaking up. Others stayed silent, unsure of where they stood. But it wasn't just the classroom that began to change. The school had always had an undercurrent of unspoken rules, traditions that leaned heavily toward keeping the status quo. Yet now, those undercurrents were starting to ripple. Students began asking more questions, not just about history but about their own school policies, their textbooks, and even their community. One day, the teacher assigned an essay on influential figures in American history. Most students chose the usual names: presidents, inventors, generals. But when she saw his topic, her face froze for a moment. He had chosen a lesser-known activist, someone who had fought tirelessly for equality in their own town many decades ago. This is an unusual choice, she said, holding up his paper. Are you sure you can find enough credible information on this individual? He nodded, meeting her gaze without hesitation. I'm sure. The days leading up to the essay deadline were grueling. He spent hours poring over documents, letters, and articles, determined to paint a full picture of this forgotten figure. The more he learned, the more parallels he saw between their struggles and his own. It wasn't just history anymore, it was personal. The day essays were returned, the class buzzed with anticipation. She handed back each paper with a brief comment, her face betraying no emotion. When she reached his desk, she paused, her expression unreadable as she placed the essay face down in front of him. See me after class, she said quietly. The room erupted into whispers as soon as she walked out. His friends nudged him, asking what she could possibly want. But he just shook his head, his nerves a tangle of excitement and dread. When the last student had left, he approached her desk. She gestured for him to sit and slid his essay across the table. Your research is impressive, she began, her voice softer than he expected. But... there it was again, that word. Always a but. You seem to have a habit of focusing on controversial figures. He frowned. Why is telling the truth controversial? He asked, his tone steady but firm. For a moment, she didn't respond. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the desks. It's not about truth, she said finally. It's about how truth is presented and who gets to tell it. The room felt heavier than ever, her words hanging in the air like a challenge. He realized then that this wasn't just about her doubts or biases. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond a classroom or an essay. This was a battle over stories, over who got to shape them and why. As he left the room that day, essay in hand, he knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. What he didn't know was how far the ripples he'd started would spread or the unexpected ways they would come back to him. But for now, he walked out with his head high, ready for whatever came next. The weeks that followed were anything but quiet. The essay he had written began circulating among his classmates, sparking conversations in the hallways and the lunchroom. Some students praised his work, saying it opened their eyes to parts of history they had never learned about. Others dismissed it as unnecessary, claiming it stirred up conflict where there didn't need to be any. He didn't mind the mixed reactions, what mattered was that people were talking. The teacher, however, seemed to grow colder. Her corrections during class became sharper, her tone more clipped whenever he raised a point. It wasn't just him who noticed. "She's got it out for you," one of his friends whispered during a group assignment. "Why don't you just let it go?" But he couldn't let it go. It wasn't about winning or proving her wrong, it was about making space for stories that deserved to be heard. Outside of class, he found himself drawn into a whirlwind of research and conversations. The school library became his second home, the librarian a quiet supporter who always seemed to have a new book or article ready for him. She didn't say much, but the way she smiled and nodded when he shared what he was working on told him she understood. At home, his parents noticed his late nights and furrowed brows. One evening, his mom sat down at the kitchen table, her tea steaming between them. "You're putting a lot of energy into this," she said gently. "What's driving you?" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "It's not just about history," he finally said. "It's about what it means to be seen, to be heard. I'm tired of people acting like certain stories don't matter." She nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "Just make sure you're taking care of yourself too," she said, squeezing his hand. Fighting for something important can be exhausting. At school, the tension in the classroom began to ripple outward. Other teachers started noticing the shifts in dynamic. The principal, a quiet but observant man, called him into his office one afternoon. "I've been hearing things," he said, leaning back in his chair. "You're challenging your history teacher?" "I'm challenging the way history is being taught," he corrected, keeping his voice steady. "I just want the full picture, not the watered-down version." The principal studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Keep it respectful," he said. "But don't stop asking questions." His teacher, however, wasn't ready to back down. She introduced stricter guidelines for presentations, emphasizing the importance of sticking to approved sources. It was a thinly veiled attempt to limit the stories he could share, but he saw right through it. He doubled down, diving even deeper into archives and first-hand accounts that couldn't be dismissed as unreliable. The turning point came during a school assembly. A guest speaker, a local historian, had been invited to talk about the town's roots. As the speaker began recounting stories of settlers and early industry, something clicked in his mind. He raised his hand during the Q&A session. "Didn't this town also have a significant civil rights movement?" he asked, his voice carrying across the auditorium. The speaker paused, clearly surprised. "Yes, actually," he said. "But it's not something that gets talked about much." "Why do you ask?" He explained what he had learned during his research, his voice growing steadier as he spoke. The historian's face lit up. "You're absolutely right," he said. "It's a crucial part of our history that deserves more attention. Perhaps the school should consider adding it to the curriculum." The room buzzed with whispers, students and teachers exchanging glances. His teacher sat stiffly in her seat, her lips pressed into a thin line. The moment was a small victory, but it wasn't enough to resolve the deeper issues at play. Behind the scenes, other stories began to surface. A student from another class mentioned how they had felt dismissed by the same teacher during discussions on social justice topics. A former student, now in college, reached out to share a similar experience, saying, "I always felt like my perspective wasn't welcome in her class." As these voices grew louder, the administration couldn't ignore them. The principal arranged a meeting between him and the teacher, hoping to address the growing conflict. Sitting across from her in the cramped office, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. She, however, seemed composed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "This isn't personal," he began, choosing his words carefully. "I respect your experience and knowledge. But I think there's room for more perspectives in how we teach history." Her response was measured but firm. "I've been teaching for decades," she said. "I know what works in a classroom. And I also know that certain topics can be divisive." "History is already divisive," he countered. "But that doesn't mean we should avoid it. It means we should be honest about it." The conversation ended without resolution, leaving the air thick with unspoken tension. But he walked out of the office with his head held high. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. More students were joining the conversation, sharing their own stories and supporting his call for change. What no one knew was how much this battle was taking a toll on the teacher. At home, she found herself questioning her approach for the first time in years. She pulled out old lesson plans, rereading them with fresh eyes. Late at night, she'd sit at her desk, scrolling through articles and forums, trying to understand the perspectives she had dismissed. But her pride wouldn't let her admit it, at least not yet. The story was far from over, and the stakes were growing higher with each passing day. The school hallways felt charged, like the air before a storm. Whispers traveled faster than the morning announcements, spreading stories about the growing debate in the history class. Everyone seemed to have an opinion now, students, teachers, even parents. Some said he was brave, a voice for change that the school desperately needed. Others called him disruptive, accusing him of overstepping boundaries. He heard it all, but the noise didn't shake him. If anything, it fueled his resolve. In class, the tension was almost unbearable. Every discussion became a subtle battle. She'd present a topic with a carefully curated narrative, and he'd counter it with facts and stories she hadn't included. The class started to take sides, some students backing him, others siding with the teacher, either out of loyalty or fear of rocking the boat. The divide wasn't just intellectual, it was emotional. Friendships were tested, and the air felt heavier with every passing day. One afternoon, the principal made an announcement that caught everyone off guard. The school had decided to hold a town hall-style meeting to discuss curriculum and representation. It was framed as an opportunity for students, parents, and teachers to share their thoughts, but everyone knew it was a direct response to the growing unrest. The date was set for the following week, and the buzz in the school reached a fever pitch. He spent the days leading up to the meeting preparing. Late nights turned into early mornings as he sifted through books, articles, and even personal accounts from community elders. He wasn't just gathering information, he was building a case. His friends rallied around him, offering to help with research, practice speeches, or simply keep him grounded when the stress became overwhelming. The teacher, meanwhile, was also preparing. She felt the weight of her reputation on the line. In her decades of teaching, she had never faced anything like this. Her classroom had always been her domain, a place where her authority went unquestioned. Now, she found herself second-guessing her every move. She spent long evenings reviewing her notes, trying to anticipate his arguments and craft responses that would reinforce her perspective. But beneath the meticulous preparation was a flicker of doubt, a small voice wondering if she had been too rigid, too unwilling to evolve. The day of the meeting arrived, and the school auditorium was packed. Students sat in clusters, their energy buzzing with anticipation. Parents filled the rows behind them, some leaning forward with interest, others with skepticism. Teachers lined the edges of the room, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. The principal stood at the podium, welcoming everyone and setting the tone for what he called an open and respectful dialogue. The teacher was the first to speak. She stood at the microphone, her posture as composed as her carefully chosen words. She spoke about the importance of structure in education, the need for trusted sources, and the challenges of balancing diverse perspectives without losing focus. Her tone was calm, almost clinical, but there was an underlying defensiveness that didn't go unnoticed. When it was his turn to speak, the room fell silent. He walked to the microphone with a confidence that belied the knots in his stomach. He began by sharing what had driven him to speak up in the first place: a desire to see history taught in a way that reflected the full spectrum of human experience, not just the parts that fit neatly into a textbook. He spoke about the gaps he had found in their lessons, the voices that had been left out, and the impact it had on students like him. As he spoke, the atmosphere shifted. Some nodded in agreement, their expressions lighting up with recognition. Others crossed their arms or exchanged skeptical glances. The teacher's face remained impassive, but her clenched jaw betrayed her tension. He ended his speech with a simple but powerful question: if we don't tell the whole story, are we really teaching history? The room erupted into applause, though it wasn't unanimous. The principal stepped back to the podium, trying to regain control of the room as hands shot up from students and parents eager to join the discussion. What followed was a heated back and forth, with voices rising and emotions spilling over. Some parents defended the teacher, arguing that she was simply doing her job and that students needed structure, not chaos. Others praised him for his courage, saying it was time for the school to embrace a more inclusive approach. The teacher finally spoke again, her voice cutting through the noise. "I've always believed in the power of education to unite people," she said, her tone measured but tinged with frustration. "But unity requires discipline and a shared understanding. If we constantly challenge the foundations, where does it end?" He met her gaze, his voice steady as he replied, "It ends when everyone feels seen and heard." The tension in the room reached its peak. People leaned forward in their seats, hanging on every word, waiting to see who would back down or if either of them would. The teacher's expression softened for a brief moment, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. The principal called for a short break, sensing the need to diffuse the intensity before the meeting continued. As people filed out of the auditorium, the air was thick with unfinished conversations. Friends debated passionately, parents huddled together, and teachers exchanged wary glances. He stood near the edge of the stage, surrounded by a small group of supporters, their encouragement giving him strength. Across the room, the teacher stood alone, her thoughts hidden behind a mask of professionalism. Neither of them knew what the next part of the meeting would bring, but both felt the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about a lesson plan or a classroom anymore. It was about something much bigger: a clash of values, perspectives, and the very purpose of education itself. And while neither was ready to give in, both were beginning to realize that the resolution wouldn't be as simple as winning or losing. It would require something deeper, something neither of them fully understood yet. The room buzzed with tension as everyone returned from the break. Conversations that had started in hushed tones during the pause were now more animated, carrying the weight of unresolved emotions. The principal called the room to order, his voice steady but lacking the confidence of a man who had control over the situation. The debate had clearly grown larger than even he had anticipated, and now it seemed to have a life of its own. Just as the meeting resumed, an unexpected voice from the back of the room cut through the murmur of settling seats. It was one of the janitors, a soft-spoken older man who had worked at the school longer than most of the staff had taught there. He rarely spoke up in public forums, but his presence commanded respect from everyone who knew him. He stood, adjusting the cap he always wore, and said, "I wasn't planning on saying anything, but I've seen a lot of history myself. And I think what we're talking about here is bigger than just a class." The room grew quiet, all eyes turning to him. He continued, his voice measured and calm. "I've cleaned these halls for decades. Seen generations of kids come and go, each with their own struggles. And if there's one thing I've learned, it's that history is never just about facts, it's about understanding each other. If this young man wants to bring more stories to the table, isn't that something we should be open to?" His words landed like a ripple in a still pond, spreading across the room. Even the teacher seemed momentarily caught off guard, her guarded expression faltering. The janitor's unexpected contribution added a new layer to the discussion, shifting the focus from the clash between teacher and student to something more universal. But just as the tension seemed to ease, another complication arose. A group of parents who had remained silent until now began to speak up, their voices sharp and accusatory. One of them, a middle-aged woman with a stern demeanor, stood and said, "This isn't about understanding each other. It's about respect. Respect for authority, respect for tradition, and respect for the people who've been educating our kids for years. This boy is turning the classroom into a battleground." Her words stung, and for a moment, he felt the weight of the room shift against him. But before he could respond, another parent jumped in. "Authority is earned, not unquestioned," the man said, his tone firm. "If our kids are asking questions, it means they're thinking critically. Isn't that what education is supposed to be about?" The exchange quickly escalated, the room dividing into factions as more parents and students chimed in. The principal's attempts to regain control were drowned out by the growing cacophony of voices. It was chaos, a microcosm of the very debates playing out in society at large. And then, in the midst of the noise, came a revelation that no one saw coming. One of the quieter students, who had been sitting near the back of the room, raised her hand timidly. When no one noticed, she stood and spoke, her voice trembling but clear enough to cut through the commotion. "I have something to say," she began, and the room gradually fell silent. She hesitated, glancing nervously at her teacher before continuing. "Last year, I wrote an essay about my family's experience immigrating to this country. I spent weeks on it, interviewing my grandparents and digging into our history. When I turned it in, I got a C. The feedback said it wasn't relevant to the assignment." Her voice cracked, but she pressed on. "But it was relevant. It was my history. And it mattered to me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. The teacher's face turned pale, and for the first time, her confident facade cracked. It was clear that this wasn't just about one student or one essay. Patterns were emerging, stories of dismissal and exclusion that painted a more complicated picture of the classroom dynamics. The janitor, still standing, nodded slowly. "Sounds like a lot of folks here have stories that haven't been heard," he said softly. "Maybe it's time we started listening." The teacher's grip on her authority was slipping, and she knew it. But instead of retreating, she stood once more, her voice louder this time. "I've dedicated my life to this profession," she said, her tone defensive. "Everything I've done has been to prepare students for the world. If I've made mistakes, it wasn't out of malice. It was out of a belief that I was doing what was best." Her words were met with a mix of nods and skeptical glances. The janitor, the student, and the boy who had started it all exchanged a glance, as if silently acknowledging that the cracks in her armor were finally showing. But the question remained, would she be willing to change, or would she dig in deeper? The tension in the room reached its peak as the principal announced that they would hear one final comment before closing the meeting. All eyes turned to the boy, who stood once more. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe, to focus. "This was never about disrespect," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "It's about making sure everyone's story has a place in our education. We can't move forward as a school, as a community, if we're not willing to look at the whole picture. I'm not asking to erase anything, we just need to add what's been left out." The room fell silent, the weight of his words settling over everyone. The teacher stared at him, her expression unreadable, as the principal prepared to close the meeting. But just as he was about to speak, the teacher raised her hand, signaling that she had one more thing to say. Whatever she was about to reveal, it would change everything. The teacher stood at the front of the room, her hand gripping the edge of the podium as if it were the only thing keeping her steady. The weight of the discussions, the accusations, and the stories had clearly left her shaken. She looked out over the crowd, her eyes scanning the faces of her students, her colleagues, the parents. For a moment, it seemed like she might retreat, but then she straightened her back and began to speak. When I started teaching, I believed the best way to help my students succeed was by following the rules, sticking to the curriculum, and ensuring they were prepared for the tests and challenges ahead, she said, her voice trembling slightly. But somewhere along the way, I stopped listening. I thought I knew what was best, but I see now that I was wrong. The room was utterly silent. Even the faint hum of the air conditioning seemed to disappear. Her words were not defensive this time, they were reflective, almost vulnerable. I see now that teaching isn't just about the material, it's about the people. It's about every student who walks into my classroom with their own history, their own perspective, and their own voice. And I realize I haven't done enough to honor that. Her gaze landed on the boy who had challenged her. You were right to question me. And you were brave to do it in front of everyone. I can't promise to fix everything overnight, but I can promise to do better. I will listen more. I will learn. The boy was stunned. He hadn't expected this. His mind raced, searching for any trace of insincerity in her voice, but he found none. For the first time, he saw not the authority figure he'd been battling, but a person who was genuinely trying to change. He nodded slowly, unsure of what else to say. But just as the room began to exhale, thinking the moment of reckoning had passed, the unexpected twist came. A soft, hesitant voice spoke up from the crowd. There's something else you all should know, said the girl who had earlier shared her story about her family's immigration. She stepped forward, holding a piece of paper in her hands. This is a copy of an email I received last year, she said, her hands trembling. It was anonymous, but it was sent right after I shared my essay in class. It said my story didn't belong here, that I was making people uncomfortable by talking about my family's struggles. The room froze. Whispers rippled through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. The teacher's face turned pale, her eyes widening as if the weight of the accusation hit her all at once. I never sent anything like that, she stammered, her voice breaking. The girl looked at her, her expression uncertain. I don't think you did, she said softly. But someone did. And it made me feel like my voice didn't matter. The revelation sent shockwaves through the room. The discussion had uncovered more than anyone had anticipated, a deep, systemic issue within the school that went beyond a single classroom or a single teacher. The principal, clearly alarmed, stepped forward to address the situation. This is something we need to investigate thoroughly, he said, his tone firm. No student should ever feel silenced or unwelcome in our school. I will personally ensure we get to the bottom of this. The boy watched the scene unfold, his emotions a swirl of victory, anger, and a strange sense of unease. He had fought so hard to bring change, but now he realized the battle was bigger than he thought. It wasn't just about one teacher or one class, it was about the culture of the school itself. The meeting ended on a solemn note. The teacher approached him afterward, her eyes still brimming with remorse. I'm sorry for not listening sooner, she said quietly. And I'm sorry for not seeing you for who you are. I'll do better. He nodded, unsure if forgiveness could come so quickly, but appreciating the gesture nonetheless. As the crowd dispersed, he felt a hand on his shoulder. It was the janitor, his expression kind but serious. You did good today, he said. But don't stop here. Keep pushing. Keep asking questions. That's how change happens. As he walked out of the auditorium, the weight of the day settled over him. The conflicts had been addressed, but the work was far from over. He had made a difference, but he knew this was just the beginning. Change, real change, would take time, effort, and the courage to keep speaking up even when it was uncomfortable. And as he looked back at the school behind him, he realized something profound. The fight wasn't just about fixing what was broken, it was about building something better. For himself. For his classmates. And for every student who would come after them. As the crowd slowly dispersed from the auditorium, the boy lingered in the hallway, his mind still racing from the events that had unfolded. He felt the weight of everything: his own words, the teacher's apology, and the girl's revelation about the anonymous email. For all the progress that had been made, it was clear that the school still had deep, unresolved issues to confront. He had started this journey hoping to fix one problem, but now he realized he had only scratched the surface. The janitor walked past him, giving a small nod and an encouraging smile. It was a quiet reminder that, while the path ahead might be difficult, he wasn't alone in wanting change. For the first time in weeks, the boy felt something unfamiliar: hope. He stepped outside, the crisp air filling his lungs as he walked toward the parking lot where a few friends waited for him. "You okay?" one of them asked, her eyes searching his face. He nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. "Yeah, I think so. Just. It's a lot to take in." "It's not over," another friend said, crossing his arms. "The principal said they'd investigate, but you know how these things go. They might not even figure out who sent that email." "Maybe," the boy said, his voice steady. "But that doesn't mean we stop pushing. If we don't hold them accountable, who will?" His friends exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from doubt to determination. They had seen him stand up to the teacher, speak out in front of parents, and stay composed in the face of overwhelming pressure. If he could do it, so could they. Over the next few weeks, the school became a different place. Conversations sparked by the meetings spilled into classrooms, hallways, and lunch tables. Students began sharing their own stories, some for the first time, while teachers grappled with how to respond. It wasn't easy. There were heated debates, uncomfortable truths, and moments when it felt like progress was impossible. But slowly, things began to shift. The teacher, true to her word, started making changes in her classroom. She introduced new assignments that encouraged students to explore their own histories and perspectives. She listened more, asked questions, and admitted when she didn't have all the answers. It wasn't a complete transformation overnight, but it was a start. And the boy noticed. For all their clashes, he saw a side of her he hadn't before, someone willing to learn, even if it was difficult. The principal, meanwhile, launched a formal investigation into the anonymous email. It took weeks, but eventually, they traced it back to a former staff member who had since left the school. The discovery brought a sense of closure for the girl who had shared her story, though it also served as a stark reminder of how far the school still had to go to create a truly inclusive environment. The boy, now a reluctant figurehead of this informal movement for change, found himself in a new role. Students came to him with their concerns, asking for advice or simply wanting someone to listen. He wasn't sure he was ready for it, but he tried his best. He set up a small group of students who met weekly to discuss issues they saw in the school and how they could address them. The janitor, ever a quiet supporter, occasionally joined their meetings, offering his perspective and reminding them of the power of persistence. One afternoon, as he was leaving one of these meetings, the boy ran into the teacher in the hallway. She hesitated, as if unsure whether to speak, but then stepped closer. "I wanted to thank you," she said, her tone genuine. "You didn't have to challenge me the way you did, but you did. And it made me realize how much I've been missing." He nodded, unsure of what to say. "It wasn't just about you," he said after a moment. "It was about all of us. The school, the way things are. But I'm glad you're trying." They parted ways, an unspoken understanding between them that while their journey had been fraught with tension, it had also been necessary. He knew their relationship would never be easy, but it didn't have to be. What mattered was that they had both grown from the experience. By the end of the school year, the changes were undeniable. The curriculum had been updated to include more diverse perspectives, teachers were encouraged to attend workshops on cultural competency, and the student-led group had become an official part of the school community. It wasn't perfect, there were still challenges, setbacks, and resistance, but it was progress. The boy, reflecting on everything that had happened, realized how much he had changed as well. He had gone from feeling powerless to understanding the strength of his own voice. It wasn't just about speaking out, it was about listening, learning, and building bridges. Change didn't happen because of one person, it happened because people came together, even when it was hard. On the last day of school, as he walked out of the building for the final time, he felt a sense of closure. The fight wasn't over, it never truly would be, but he had done what he set out to do. And as he looked back at the school one last time, he smiled, knowing that he had left it better than he had found it.